Fingers crossed now that the technology works, because we're hoping we can very shortly welcome Policing Minister, Right Honourable Chris Philp. So can we get him on screen, please? There we are. We have him. Good morning to you, Minister.
Good morning, Stratford-on-Avon. Can you hear me? Yes. Brilliant. Okay, I think I heard a few yeses there. Well, good morning, everybody. Good morning, Paul, as well. Thank you very much indeed for inviting me to speak to you today. Look, I'm extremely sorry I couldn't join you in person. I've just come back to the Home Office from a meeting at number 10 with the Prime Minister. And unfortunately, when the Prime Minister asks for a meeting, it's not really optional. And so I'm afraid I wasn't able to get from number 10 to Stratford-on-Avon in 20 minutes. But, you know, I would love to be with you next year, and all else being equal, I will definitely come and speak in person wherever your conference may be held in 2024. And look, let me start by saying that I think one of the most important aspects of the job I do is to listen to policing at all ranks and at all levels and across the country, to understand where there are barriers that are stopping you doing your job as well as you would like to, and to try and then address whatever those problems and barriers may be. I see my role as being, amongst other things, the voice of policing in government. And the Police Superintendents Association is a vital part of that. I'm very grateful to Paul and to Harvey and all your members for the conversations and discussions that we have. I meet with Paul and Dan on a regular basis and always listen to what they have to say. And I hope often act on their suggestions and prompting, as well as Paul very kindly mentioned in his speech. And look, I think superintendents and chief superintendents play a vital role in frontline leadership. I mean, you are running the units, the BCUs and other units who are delivering frontline policing. And so you are a critical part of the way that policing, you are the sort of the glue that holds together the entire policing system. Look, I see this in my own neighbourhood in South London. I'm a member of Parliament in Croydon. I work closely with our BCU commander, Chief Superintendent Andy Britton, and with our new Borough Superintendent, Mitch Carr. And I can see the difference that Andy and Mitch are making in Croydon to the way that policing is run. So I think, you know, I can completely see the way that your leadership is critical to the way the public get kept safe. And of course, we should keep in mind that there is no society, there is no civilization without the role that policing perform, because without public safety, without law and order, we cannot have a functioning society. So I think the work that you and your colleagues do up and down the country every day is just amongst the most important work that any public servants undertake. And that is why public safety, people often say, is the first duty of the state. I think British policing at its best is truly world class. We saw, for example, both at the funeral of Her Majesty the late Queen about this time last year, and in the coronation a few months ago, we saw policing, I think, at its best, facilitating those events that passed off safely. The eyes of the world were upon us. And despite the fact there were very specific intelligence reports that we had in the few hours, 24, 48 hours before the coronation in particular, showing plots to disrupt proceedings, the police responded I think, fantastically in making sure that event of huge national significance passed off without significant incident. And I think the Metropolitan Police who led the operation, Thames Valley in Windsor, NPOC, and all of those forces, probably almost every force in the country who provided mutual aid, did a fantastic job in making sure that event of national significance went so well. Like Paul, I was at, many people here probably, I was at the Police Bravery Awards a few weeks ago, back I think it was in July, hearing not just about the fantastic job the police do in keeping the public safe, but about the sacrifices that many individual officers make in the line of duty, and the stories of extraordinary courage were extremely moving. I saw and met officers who had tackled, criminals who were armed with knives or guns, in one case with explosives, and those officers put themselves in the line of danger to disarm those criminals at huge personal risk. There were officers from the West Midlands who had gone onto a frozen lake in an effort to rescue children who were drowning. Extraordinary stories of bravery from around the country. And of course, as Paul mentioned, I'm sure that on all of our minds today is the memory of Sergeant Graham Saville of the Nottinghamshire Force, who just a week or two ago made the ultimate sacrifice. He gave his life in the line of duty, trying to save, in fact, successfully saving the life of a member of the public on a railway track. And I know that our thoughts and prayers will be with Great Sergeant Saville's family at what must be an awfully difficult time. He had 2 young children, as you probably know. And look, I'm sure all of us have seen these kind of sacrifices. As a Croydon MP, I think constantly about Sergeant Matt Ratana, who was murdered in the custody suite in Croydon. And of course, as a Member of Parliament, I remember PC Keith Palmer, who lost his life protecting Parliament and thereby protecting our democracy. So those are just some examples of the exceptional, the ultimate sacrifice made in the line of duty. But I know every day police officers put themselves in danger to protect the rest of us, to keep the public safe. So I would like to start by saying, just on behalf of the government, but the public, my own constituents in Croydon, just a huge thank you for the work you do to keep us safe, the bravery, the dedication, and the sacrifice that you make. So thank you. Now, we talked a bit about, or Paul talked a bit in his speech about resources and police officer numbers, and that is an important topic. Clearly, you can't do your job properly as leaders in the police force without the resources that you need. And that, of course, does start with officer numbers, and that's been debated a lot. Speaking for where we are today, as of March the 31st this year, we had 149,566 officers across England and Wales, which has gone up by about 20,000. It's gone up by 20,591 in the last 3 years, which has more than made up for the challenges that existed in the years immediately after 2010. So we now have 3,542 to be precise, 3,500 more police officers than we have ever had before, including in the Met, which has about 35,000 officers. That's about 2,000 more than it had before, which I think does help do that neighbourhood policing work that Paul spoke about, and I completely support. And that's one of the places that we would like to see those extra officers getting deployed. It's also meant that your ranks can be reinforced. So again, in London, every borough now has a dedicated superintendent. It's Mitch Carr in Croydon, as well as the chief superintendents commanding the various BCUs. And I think adding that borough superintendent for all of London's 32 boroughs is important. And I hope other forces around the country take a careful look at that as well. So I would like to again say thank you to all the people here, the superintendents, chief superintendents who were involved in that recruitment campaign to hit those record numbers. We're now very keen to maintain those record officer numbers going forward, and we have designed the financial package that police and crime commissioners receive to make sure that the resources are there to maintain those officer numbers. I'm very conscious that recruitment programme means that a very high proportion of officers are relatively new. So to get those 21,000 net extra officers in 3 years, we had to actually hire about 48,000 officers to obviously backfill the turnover in those 3 years. So about a third of officers have less than about 3.5 years experience. So that is obviously quite a large proportion. So I'm very conscious of the need to properly train them, mentor them, bring them on. So I think anything we can do to encourage more experienced officers, particularly those at the 30-year service point, just to stay a little bit longer in service, even a couple of years, 2 or 3 years, just to impart their experience to the next generation is useful. And I know that chief officers, chief constables do have the ability to fund the pension abatement issue in order to make sure that the financial incentive for more experienced officers can be put in place if that would make a difference. I would also just echo the points that Paul made about the importance of well-being. Obviously, policing can be quite a stressful job emotionally in terms of mental health, as well as the physical danger involved that I touched upon earlier. So the work of the Police Wellbeing Board is something I take extremely seriously. I think Paul sits on that as well, and there is a lot more I think we can do. We've got a chief medical officer for policing now, but there is a lot more we can do, I think, to make sure we're supporting officers at all ranks in doing this very difficult and very challenging job. So I think we've got some good news there on police numbers, but I'm also very keen to make sure that we are removing and reducing the burdens that can sometimes take time away from frontline policing. And one of the when I was first appointed about a year ago, I spoke to a lot of officers, from frontline officers through to borough commanders, BCU commanders, through to chief constables and the Met Commissioner, and I heard a few consistent messages, things they were asking me to go and try and sort out. And one of those was to do with the bureaucracy of the Home Office counting rules. Now, I'm very keen that we don't spend excessive or unnecessary time on essentially bureaucracy. Obviously, we need to count crime properly, but we need to make sure it's done in a way that is proportionate and doesn't take up too much time. So we made some changes just a few months ago in response to those requests. For example, removing the need to double record or multiply record crimes around stalking, harassment and controlling coercive behaviour. Obviously, those crimes need recording, but we don't need to multiply record what is essentially the same course of conduct. So that will save time. We've also removed the need to record Section 5 public order crimes when the disorder is over and there's no further action necessary. And we've also taken steps to ensure that malicious communication only needs to be recorded where the criminal threshold has clearly been met, and not when people simply feel offended but there's no criminality. So those changes and others to the Home Office counting rules, which I know are quite onerous, will, according to the MPCC, save nearly 500,000 hours of police time each year. That is time that can obviously be better spent on the streets, visibly policing and also investigating crime, which I'll come on to a little later. The second thing, which I heard from essentially everybody from Mark Rowley through to the frontline emergency response teams in Croydon. Sorry to mention Croydon so much, but I spend a lot of time there, so it's informs a lot of thinking. They all said, everyone, and across the country, not just in London, across the country, police leaders talked about the amount of time being taken up by responding to essentially mental health issues. That is in terms of emergency response teams taking patients to a hospital where they require admission under the Mental Health Act, and having to often wait, very long periods of time, 10 hours plus, before the patient was admitted. And I was struck by the Humberside model. I'm not sure if we've got any supers from Humberside here, but Humberside had a very good model called Right Care, Right Person, where essentially the NHS, the ambulance service and the NHS looked after mental health patients where there was no crime and there was no threat to public safety or the patient's own safety. So it's essentially a medical situation. And police only responded when there was a threat to public safety or the person's safety or criminality. And that transition, that work in Humberside was effective. There was no diminution in the quality of care, but it freed up 17,000 hours a year of police time in Humberside alone. And so I was asked by a lot of police leaders to try and replicate that nationally. So I went away and spoke to the ministers in the Department of Health and Social Care to see if we could get an agreement to do that nationally. We successfully got that agreement, the National Partnership Agreement, which was announced, I think, in July. And now that Humberside approach should be and will be applied nationally. It'll be rolled out in each individual area. It'll be phased depending on how quickly the health service can spin up its capacity, but that should happen quickly, and that should not be a long process. And I would just urge you to get behind that in each of your force areas, because it's in the interest of the patient, because if they're suffering what is essentially a medical problem, then they're better treated by medical professionals, not by the police. And clearly, it will free up huge amounts of police time to focus on protecting the public. And again, working with the MPCC, we estimate that will free up over 1 million hours a year of police time to concentrate on protecting the public and catching criminals, which I think is what we all want to do. So it's a win-win, I think, for everybody. So please get behind the rollout of that. We're going to be monitoring it from the Home Office, working with DHSC, but obviously we need your help to make it happen on the ground. But you've now got a national framework to make this happen in each of your areas. The other point that's been raised with me repeatedly by the policing family is around the interaction with the CPS. We meet to discuss this regularly with my colleagues across government and the DPP. I think it's fair to say that there is still work ongoing, discussing issues like the boundary between police and CPS charging decisions, issues to do with redaction, which I know takes up a lot of police time, particularly in relation to case files prior to the charging decision, and DG6. And I know all of those things take up a lot of time. So I can't sort of announce any news just today, but it is something which I and colleagues are working on day and night. So I'm doing everything I can to try and help in those areas as well. I would also, in this area, just endorse the work of the productivity review, which former Kent Chief Constable Alan Pewsley is working on. They're going to have some recommendations this autumn that should help efficiency and productivity, just removing those burdens which are taking officer time away from frontline duties. Very much welcome input from the Supers Association and from Paul into that. One of the issues I know that they're going to be thinking about, and which is something you may want to think about as well, is the number of officers on long-term sick and restricted duties. It is quite a high proportion, and I think if we can manage that down, it will free up a lot of officers to help protect the public. So please just give some thought to that as you look at your own workforce. I know that Alan Pewsley will consider it, but do consider it locally as well. But essentially, one of my duties is to make sure you get the resources you need, and I fight that battle on a daily basis in government. It's also to make sure your time is freed up, or your officers' time is freed up to do that frontline work. I've given a few examples just now, but I will continue doing that, fighting for resources and removing bureaucratic burdens. And if there's anything more that we need to do beyond what I've spoken about already, I'd love to hear about that either in the Q&A today or from Paul and Dan and Harvey subsequently, because I'm always on the lookout for new ideas to try and make the system work better. Now, in terms of our objectives as a government, I think they're the same objectives as yours. It's to visibly police and to fight crime. It's worth mentioning that crime in England and Wales is actually coming down, has been coming down since 2010, according to the Crime Survey of England and Wales. According to the ONS, it's the only statistically reliable way of measuring crime over the long term. And since March 2010, neighbourhood crime, as measured by the Crime Survey, which neighbourhood crime includes burglary, robbery, vehicle theft and so on, it's down 51%, violent crime down by 46%. And as Andy Cook, Her Majesty's Chief Inspector, said in his State of Policing report, arguably the country has never been safer. But public perception can often be different, particularly if there are crime hotspots or there are particular crime types like knife crime in urban centres, which do need more work doing on them. Social media obviously amplifies the perception of crime in a way that didn't happen 10 or 15 years ago. So although all major crime types are significantly down since 2010, public perception doesn't always reflect that. So I think we've still got a lot of work to do, and we definitely have no room to be complacent. And that's why the Home Secretary and I last week or the week before last announced this initiative, by agreement with the National Police Chiefs Council and with the College of Policing, with Chief Constable Andy Marsh there, and with Andy Cook, the Her Majesty's Chief Inspector, to always follow all reasonable lines of inquiry where they exist and where they're proportionate for all crime. So not to screen out minor crime and just say we're not going to investigate that, it's not important enough, to always follow a reasonable line of inquiry. And we think that zero tolerance approach is important, because those crimes that are perceived as minor obviously do affect the victim, whether it's shoplifting, phone theft, whatever it may be. They do affect the victim. They do affect public confidence in policing. I'll talk about the conduct issue in a minute, but effectively investigating crime where there is a reasonable lead is important. Stephen Watson, the Chief Constable in Greater Manchester, started to introduce this about 18 months ago to great effect. They've doubled their arrest rate in Greater Manchester. And in fact, they've been so successful, they've had to open up 2 new magistrates' courts in Greater Manchester and reopen some custody suites that had previously been closed down because they've arrested so many additional criminals. And I asked Stephen Watson, tell me about the extra resources. Did it require extra resources? And he said that actually what it did was it unlocked what he termed, these are his words, latent capacity in investigation teams and in neighbourhood teams. Latent capacity. It did require more custody suites eventually, because more people were getting nicked. But he described latent capacity in investigation teams. So that was, I think, quite interesting. And it sort of goes back to that broken windows philosophy that New York Police Department Commissioner Bill Bratton talked about in the 1990s, and that he repeated when he was LAPD Commissioner, I think from 2002 to 2009. If you tackle the crimes like shoplifting, ASB, various forms of theft, it creates an atmosphere of public safety. It avoids an atmosphere of disorder or menace developing. It avoids an atmosphere being created in which more serious crimes can flourish, or in which particular offenders go through a scale of escalating offending. And it actually makes the public feel a lot safer, and it denies criminals the space in which they can operate. So I think it is really important, and I think technology can help us do this. So one thing I would particularly point to is the potential presented to deliver the reasonable lines of inquiry, or reasonable lines of inquiry commitment, using facial recognition from video footage recovered from CCTV cameras, things like Ring doorbells, mobile phones, and so on. The algorithm, I'm sure many of you obviously are doing this already, but the algorithms that we use to face match have become, in the last 6 or 12 months, extraordinarily sophisticated. And I've seen some images recovered from crime scenes, CCTV camera footage principally, where looking at it as a layperson, you think there is no way you're going to get a match on that picture against the PND database or the force's own custody database. But the algorithm, the matching algorithm, is now so good that they are getting matches on those images. So I would strongly encourage anyone to try and recover every image, run it through the PND database, and it's quite likely you'll get a hit. And some forces are doing this to a great extent already. All forces are doing it to some extent, but not every force is doing it as much as they could do. And the technology is now so powerful. I think it is one of the most, and CCTV footage is so ubiquitous, and Ring doorbell footage, mobile phone footage. I think it will have, over the next few years, just an enormous impact on our ability to lock up criminals. And it's an efficient way of investigating crime, because particularly if the victim or the shop or whatever it is emails in the footage, that's a very efficient way of getting the evidence that can then be acted upon. So I would just strongly endorse the zero tolerance approach that has been agreed in following all reasonable lines of inquiry. NPCC are behind it, the college is behind it, the inspector will inspect against it as well. And I think it will really help us demonstrate to the public that we are taking every crime, even what have historically been considered minor crimes, very seriously. Now, Paul rightly touched in his remarks earlier on standards and conduct. We've obviously all probably read Baroness Casey's rather hard-hitting report into the Met, and we've seen those terrible high-profile cases there. But obviously there are issues not just in the Met, in other forces as well. And I think rebuild and making sure that trust and confidence in policing is maintained is critical. I think the work that the Commissioner is doing in the Met is something we support fully. He and other senior officers asked us to look at the rules around dismissals for misconduct, and we've responded to their request. And you'll have seen the announcement a week or two ago. And the panel, the misconduct panel, will still contain 2 lay people, a legally qualified member and a lay member, as well as a senior officer who will now chair the panel. So there is still obviously a lay majority, a non-police majority, but we have strengthened rightly the power of senior officers, chief officers in particular, to take action where necessary, in order to make sure only those who deserve to wear the uniform and carry the badge do so. We do need to make sure trust is rebuilt, trust and confidence are rebuilt. But in saying all of that, and I always say this whenever I do any media around police conduct, the vast majority of police officers are hardworking, decent and brave. What we need to do is just address that small minority, very small minority, who are letting us down. And that is what the recent reforms are designed to do. and I think all of us in our just day-to-day interactions with officers and in your leadership roles, just make sure there is no tolerance for the sort of behaviour which has unfortunately cast a shadow. But I'm confident that working on those issues, as we are doing across the country, in government, police leadership, the whole policing family, I'm confident that we can address this, indeed are addressing it already, and that we will make sure that the public have the trust and confidence in policing that we all want them to have. And that is partly around delivering the visible police service on the ground. It's also around taking proactive action, as the Met and other forces around the country are doing. And whatever is needed to support that from government, I'm here to provide. So please just come and ask if you need anything further. I can promise you Paul is not shy. Paul is not shy in doing that. Look, I'm conscious we want to leave time for questions. So I will draw to a conclusion, but let me just repeat what I said at the beginning, to say a huge thank you for the work that you and the officers serving under your leadership are doing to protect the public. I think the service ethos that I see daily up and down the country is something in the police service, police forces, are something that we can all be very proud of. You're protecting the public, you're keeping us safe. We're very grateful for the work you're doing. And if there is anything more you need from government, my job is to be here to listen to you, to try and make sure you have everything you need to perform the leadership role that you are called upon to discharge. So whenever anything comes up, please ask, and I'll do my level best to get it sorted out. And finally, thank you, Paul, again for the work you do in your job with the Supers Association. Look forward to continuing to work with you in the weeks, months, and hopefully years ahead. Thank you.
Minister, thank you. Minister, thank you very much. You actually went 5.5 minutes over your time, so we're going to keep you for 5.5 minutes over, if that's all right.
Fair enough.
That's fine. We're going to do that, I promise you. You've got a lot to say, and we were very pleased to hear it. However, I just wondered, given you have the most senior police officers here in the room, in the country, in this room, and they have a lot to say, would it have been an idea perhaps to have done a Zoom with the Prime Minister and be here in person?
Well, next year I will definitely come in person. It is very difficult to turn down an invitation from the PM when he asks you to come and see him about something. But I'll be there next year in person, wherever it is.
But it's becoming a habit, you see. A couple of years ago, we had the same response from the then Home Secretary, Priti Patel, and we haven't had the current Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, here. So when are we going to get somebody in person?
Next year, promise.
Okay, we've recorded that. And we'll hold you to it. All right, let me get on with the questions, because lots and lots have come in. And these are in order of popularity, so they may well be a little bit all over the place. But the first one is, what is your view on the recent letter from the Home Secretary with regards to political activism? There is significant concern from police leaders and partners around this direction. We've seen it yesterday at this conference. It's certainly around. What is your view?
Well, look, I think what the Home Secretary was saying in her letter is that for the police to enjoy the trust and confidence of the whole community, there needs to be just a consciousness and a bit of thought about where that line lays. And I think I agree with the Home Secretary that impartiality is important, and even where a cause seems like a very good one, when an event is being policed, whatever the event may be, the police are there to police it rather than to participate in it, no matter how good the cause is. And I think that is something just to be a bit conscious of. I mean, Mark Rowley, the Met Commissioner, has made some recent comments on this around, wearing symbols on the uniform. So I mean, that's obviously operationally a matter for him. So I do understand where the Home Secretary is coming from on that. I think policing without fear or favour does require impartiality rather than participation. But I do understand the need to make sure that we also have the confidence of particular groups, especially those that are, that are marginalised, to know that the police are there to protect them as well. But I think there is a way to strike that balance.
What is that What is that way to strike that balance? Because police officers would argue inclusion is a huge part of policing, and that's why they get the results they get. So what is the way you're saying where you can strike the balance?
Well, I think I said it a second ago when I said, support for marginalised groups, being there to protect them when they need protecting, right? That's what policing's about. But when that crosses into participation, even where the cause looks like a good one, the police aren't really there to participate in those events. They're there to police them and protect those who are participating. I think that's where I would draw the line.
But what's the harm?
Well, I think what the Home Secretary was seeking to draw attention to is that, even for causes that you and I would consider good ones, the public don't expect the police to participate in those. They expect them to police them, right? That is where the line is. And where do you then get into sort of where do you draw it? Is it this event or not this event? And how do you calibrate? Does it require support of 70% of the public before the police participate? 80%, 50%? Where do you draw the line? So it's better just to have a simple principle that you police without fear or favour, you don't participate, but you protect. And I think if we have those simple guide rails, we won't go wrong.
Okay, at this point, because it's such a big issue, I just want to take a poll from our audience, and I appreciate you can't necessarily see that, but does anybody here, hands up please, if you agree with what you're hearing from the policing minister, or you disagree? Hands up if you agree. Not one hand, Minister. Not one hand. So is it just the Home Secretary's view, or is it indeed the public's view? Because I think that's the problem for policing. They don't see the harm in it. They don't see that's affecting the way they police events. And I know you talked about inclusion in some of those. I'm guessing you're referring to Pride and marches like that. But if they don't see it, and they don't see it affecting the way they actually do their job, what is the point of making that comment?
Okay, well, look, I've heard the comments made here and the response, and I'll pass it back to the Home Secretary.
Okay, fine, thank you. Let's move on then. With the why are you making forces maintain officer numbers while having to save millions? The effect is that police staff numbers will drop, officers will backfill these roles, creating a false effect to the public.
Well, I think maintaining officer numbers is important because, we need warranted officers with powers of arrest to visibly patrol and to investigate crime and arrest criminals thereafter. So officer numbers are self-evidently important. We've heard Paul and others talk about the importance of neighbourhood policing. That requires warranted officers with the full range of powers that comes with that. In terms of the question about sort of financial resources, what I've tried to do in the year I've been in the job is to maximise the amount of money that gets to the front line. So the money that's spent by police and crime commissioners on frontline policing. So this year we're in now, 2023-24, by increasing the precept flexibility that PCCs have, by reducing some of the what I thought were less impactful home office programmes and moving that money to the front line and increasing the block grant. Frontline policing this year has £552 million more than it had last year. And on top of that, when the police pay settlement came through, the 7% that we heard referred to, and of course the extra £5,000 for the top chief superintendent band on top of that, there was concern about how that would be funded. Now, most police forces had budgeted 2.5% for that pay rise, and I fought quite a intense battle in government to make sure that all of that pay rise, the 7%, for both police officers and one assumes police staff, above the 2.5% was fully funded by the government, so it didn't have to come out of frontline budgets. So I know that some forces, will say they would like more money, and I completely understand that, but we've got that extra 550 million to the front line this year. I'm going to try and do the same again next year, and we fully funded the pay rise above 2.5. Quite a few chief constables and police and crime commissioners were worried we wouldn't do that, and they would have to find cuts, essentially, efficiency savings to fund some of the pay rise, but over 2.5%. But we managed to avoid that. So I will try and do the same thing again next year and just maximise the financial resources that the front line gets. But I think it is important, it's critical in fact, that we maintain officer numbers for the reason I set out, and we're going to design the funding settlement next year to reward and incentivise that. Okay,
we just want to stay on that point. Well, actually, we'll increase the question, well, widen the question, I should say, to talking about the 20,000 extra officers, because I think you said, and I'm quoting you now, you said increased numbers of officers, the 20,000, has more than made up for the challenges that policing face. The question we've got in is what proportion of that 20,000 extra, and extras in inverted commas, does the Minister think are now partly or wholly filling roles previously and more effectively filled by police staff lost under austerity? And that's the argument, isn't it? Those numbers only replaced what was cut back in 2010.
Well, just to be clear on the numbers, they more than replace it. So,
but not by much.
I'll give you the numbers. So in March 2010, which was the previous high point, there were 146,030 officers in England and Wales. On March 31st this year, there were 149,566. So there were 3,500 more officers March of this year compared to the previous peak, 3,500 extra. We recruited the net increase in the last 3 years was 20,951. But the number to really focus on is how many more we had than the previous peak, which was reached in March 2010, 3,500 extra. Obviously, in the years following 2010, this was before I was even in Parliament, but the country was in financially a bit of a mess, as the outgoing Labour Chief Secretary, Liam Byrne, famously said in his note to his successor, there's no money left. And that meant, owing to the terrible financial legacy that government had to clean up, difficult decisions got made across the public sector. What we've done in the last 3 years and what I've done in the last year is deliver those record numbers. On the point about police staff, it varies by force. I know that some forces make this point, and that's why I will, in next year's settlement, as in this year's, I'll try and get as much cash as I can to the front line in order to make sure that roles that can best be done by police staff are done, freeing up officers for patrolling and investigating crime. So I do understand the point, and that's how I'm going to try and address it.
You talk about 2010, but we're in 2023. You know, population is much, much bigger. We've got more complex police needs. We have policing that has to be done in many different ways now compared to 2010. So why is 3,500 the correct number, for instance? Many would say that's not enough.
Well, it is a record number. And of course, as I said, overall crime measured by the crime survey is down like for like by around about 50%. So there are fewer crimes being committed, although public perception is often different for the reasons I mentioned in my comments. But, you know, I'm always going to be arguing for more resources. I mean, my job in government is to make the case for more resources. I think I've been, successful in delivering record numbers. I've got the extra more than £500 million this year compared to last year, and I'm going to try and do the same again next year.
Did you talk about it to the Prime Minister this morning?
We did actually, yeah.
And what did he say?
Well, I think conversations in government are normally treated as confidential, but we did talk about police officer numbers and funding, yes.
OK, so is nothing you want to share with us then, Minister? Is that what you say?
Not just now.
OK, all right. If you don't ask, anyway, never mind.
But well done for asking.
I'm going to carry on, don't worry. We've got another question for you. You mentioned reducing sickness, but many officers cannot get access to doctors and medical procedures needed to return to work. And you talked about the number of officers obviously being off sick long term. I'm sure it's the same for other blue light services, but would the government consider health screening and prioritising treatment for emergency workers to improve well-being and reduce sickness across blue light services?
Yeah, so first of all, it's worth pointing out that the variation between the 43 police forces in England and Wales is quite large. So as a percentage, the force with the highest level of long-term sick and restricted duties is in fact, it's more like 4 times the lowest level and almost double the average. So there's a lot of variation between forces that we're going to be taking a look at. On your question about prioritisation of health services, I think that is an idea that I will take away and discuss. It's obviously, one has to be fair to all members of the public, clearly, but making sure that officers get the treatment they need, especially around, obviously physical injuries, of course, but mental health support as well, is very very important because policing is uniquely, or can be uniquely stressful and traumatising, along with some other blue light services for obvious reasons. So I'm very conscious there is a particular demand on the sort of mental health side of it, and that is something I'm going to be looking at, yes. And I'm sure Paul and the Supers Association will be, feeding into that and discussing it with us.
Okay. You have said that you're always on the lookout for new ideas to assist the service. National President Paul has just tabled 8 clear asks. We saw them up on a screen. We don't think you've taken the opportunity to address any of them in your response, quite frankly. In particular, I want to talk about one that affects every aspect of policing, the criminal justice system review that was promised 4 years ago. Nothing has happened. Why not?
Yeah, well, it's been obviously quite a turbulent 4 years with COVID and all the rest of it, which clearly has, taken up a lot of our collective time and attention. There aren't any immediate plans that I'm aware of to initiate a Royal Commission, and I think our focus at the moment, really, and obviously that was a commitment made by 2 Prime Ministers ago. Our focus really, day to day, is on just improving the system as it currently is, and I'm responsible for the police part of that. So, taking away the bureaucratic burdens I talked about, making sure the pay settlement was funded, getting more resources to the front line, making sure the legal powers the police need are in place, just making sure, in some ways it's not glamorous stuff, but it's just the everyday work. My job is every day to work out how we can improve the system. Listen to officers, frontline officers, chief officers, superintendents, everybody, to improve the system. That's what I'm focusing on every single day, relentlessly, and I think it is working. It is yielding results.
No, and we hear you, Minister, and we understand what you're saying on those particular aspects, the everyday policing. But this goes a huge way to building trust back from the public into the police, and equally, it helps everyday policing. So, is there any hope of it actually progressing?
Well, I think we are making a lot of changes, and I've talked about quite a few of them this morning. It's easy to say, well, let's have a big Royal Commission and it'll sort of be some magic bullet. These things, they're certainly not quick. I mean, Royal Commissions take years to undertake, right? So there's nothing quick about it, and I'm not sure there is always. Obviously that commitment predated my time as a minister, but these Royal Commission type reviews, rarely uncover some silver bullet. Speaking personally, I would rather just get on with the job and try and improve things on a day-to-day basis. And I hope you could tell from the remarks I made earlier, that is what I'm trying to do across all of those things I talked about. And I know police leaders of all ranks are doing the same day-to-day as well.
We appreciate it takes time, but there have been various reviews and reports that have been commissioned over the years. They've been completed. We've had lots of recommendations, but nothing seems to change. Why is there no accountability?
Well, I don't accept the thesis that nothing has changed. I mean, in my remarks, and I'm sorry they were 5.5 minutes over. If I did that in the House of Commons, the Speaker would just shut me up. I listed a whole load of things that have changed: resources, numbers, dismissal powers, stripping out bureaucracy. Loads of things. Funding the pay rise above 2.5%. Loads of things that have changed. We've changed the law in a number of areas to give the police more powers around public order, to make sure the public don't get disrupted by just stop. Loads of things. We've just changed knife legislation. We're about to change knife legislation. We're supporting the police in their use of stop and search to take knives off the street. There are loads of things that have changed. So I don't, if I may respectfully say, accept the thesis of the question.
Okay. I'm going back to the Home Sec's comments, her letter with this question. Would you attend Pride in Croydon if you felt it would help build trust with a historically marginalised group? The rest of the question, sorry if I may, is just policing isn't just there to protect the LGBTQ plus community, but also to find out what they need. So would you attend Pride in Croydon, Minister? Well,
not only would I attend Pride, I have attended Pride, and in fact I spoke on the big stage, and I did actually myself. I have the rainbow thing on my face, but I was there as a member, as not as a police officer. There were police officers there as well. So yes, I have attended Pride in Croydon and I participated in it.
Okay, so I would say
including on the stage.
Okay, I would say then, as a member of the public, not anything to do with policing or indeed government, what's the difference if a police officer attends Pride and takes part in it, and a member of Parliament takes part in Pride? You know, you're both there to serve the public, so what's the difference?
Well, I think police should attend Pride in order to obviously protect and reassure the people participating in it. But I think the principles around, and we've discussed this already, so I don't want to sort of repeat myself. There is this point about without fear or favour, and that line between protecting and policing and supporting, which is what the police are there to do, versus participation. Obviously, you know, politicians are different to the police. Politicians our job is to be political, so in different ways, sometimes rightly, sometimes wrongly. So there is a difference between politicians and the police, obviously.
Yeah, but everything's political nowadays, Minister, if you don't mind me saying. I still don't see the difference. I'm sorry, I might be being really daft here, but I don't see the difference.
Well, policing is not supposed to be in any way political, and sometimes there are causes that have 95% public support, but they still have a political dimension. That's the point the Home Secretary was making. But look, I heard the points earlier in the discussion, and I will pass those back to the Home Secretary, I promise.
Okay. How much additional resource is going into mental health services to ease pressure on police?
Yeah, quite a lot. So I've discussed this obviously with my colleagues in the Department of Health, and we had this discussion when they agreed to roll out Right Care, Right Person across the country under the auspices of the National Partnership Agreement. So they're spending a lot of extra money on things like mental health ambulances to convey patients suffering a mental health episode to a health setting. They're investing in more mental health places of safety. So there are places for those people to go. We don't want to have any Section 136 patients, ideally in police cells. We want them in mental health places of safety, which can be hospitals, but they might be other places as well. So the NHS are putting a lot of extra money into this, including capital spending for ambulances, mental health ambulances, and physical locations, and also making sure that in A&E there is money to make sure that the patient upon arrival can be received quickly, because they have and admitted quickly. We've got a 1 hour guideline in the National Partnership Agreement. I've heard cases where officers have been sitting in A&E for like 10 hours before the patient has been admitted. So we're going to be working now towards a 1 hour handover time, and that is being resourced.
Okay. What is the government's plan to redress the real terms pay loss police officers at all ranks have suffered without reducing core police budgets?
Well, obviously we have a police remuneration review body which is independent of government, and this year, I think as last year, we accepted its recommendation in full. That is something that I advocated for and the Home Secretary advocated for in government for all kinds of reasons, including the one that you mentioned, but also we're conscious obviously that the police don't have the right to strike. So I think given that, it was important to accept their recommendation. That 7% was the, along with firefighters also got 7%, that was I think the highest or joint highest settlement in the public sector, and you know, as I said, we made sure that was funded in its entirety over 2.5% by the government to avoid police and crime commissioners or chief constables having to cut services to fund it. And I think they were talking to the chiefs and police and crime commissioners after that announcement. It was the funding arrangement was significantly better than they were expecting. But I will try and do that in the future as well. But
it is still a pay cut in real terms, isn't it? I mean, it was in the headlines today, this morning. That was the average pay rise for lots of people, but it's still a real terms pay cut.
Yeah, so look, I mean, 7%, the 7% was roughly in line with where earnings growth across the economy has been. It's in line with that. You know, there has been a global inflation crisis. Thankfully, it now appears to be reducing and abating, going down each month. But look, it's been a tough year for everybody in the public sector and the private sector. But I say that 7% was the highest or joint highest of any public sector workforce.
Okay. We've got a few minutes left. I want to ask you this question, please. Do you think the 43 force model is sustainable with 43 chief constables and 42 PCCs and a mayor all pulling in different directions? Isn't it time for a national police service with clear national objectives and local accountability boards to ensure that local accountability along the lines of the representative police authorities happens?
Well, I mean, if that question was suggesting we should merge all 43 police forces into a single police force, I mean that would be one gigantic organisation. So I'm not convinced that a merger of all 43 forces would necessarily be a particularly good idea. Clearly, some of the forces are quite small, but there aren't, to answer the question, there aren't any current plans to legislate to enforce mergers, because they're disruptive and everything, and it would undermine potentially that local accountability. What I'm concentrating, rather than going for those kind of organisational changes, I just want us to perform better in the current framework. I'm just concentrating on the day-to-day. There are obviously regional and national structures, as everyone here knows. Obviously, there are the ROCUs, the Regional Organised Crime Units, which cover regions. The National Crime Agency, obviously dealing with threats on a national and supranational level. So, and obviously, you've got CT policing covering the country as well. So we do have those national capabilities. Obviously, the National Police Chiefs Council provides leadership on a national basis where needed. So I understand the case, and I understand the case about efficiency and so on. But right now, my priority is just making the system work better as it is, rather than completely sort of ripping it up and starting again, which would be quite disruptive. But I do understand the rationale.
Okay, just because I've seen a question related to this, how will the government hold forces to account for the uplift into ROCUs now there are no longer financial penalties?
Well, I think a number of officers in the Uplift programme have been directed into ROCUs. I'm trying to remember the exact figure. I think it's, from memory, it's about 700 or something like that, but that is from memory, so don't hold me to that. So quite a few of those extra officers have been directed into ROCUs, and we're also working now. We've got a SOC, serious organised crime strategy, that we're working through with the NCA, and that will feed through to ROCUs. So we are particularly paying attention to that from the Home Office, because that pull through from the NCA to the ROCUs is important, and we want to go after those OCGs in quite an organised way, and the ROCUs have a critical role to play in that.
Okay. This is very popular. It may well be our last question, but the strongest evidence base to increase trust and confidence is from effective neighbourhood policing. What's the government doing to support that neighbourhood policing?
Well, I think first and foremost, delivering those record numbers of police officers, because we've now got 149,566. There are, by definition, many more officers who can be deployed to neighbourhoods. And I know chief constables and chief officers and supers around the country are using those extra resources very often in that way. I know, for example, I know I keep talking about Croydon, but it's my own borough. We've now got a town centre team of 20 officers who are hitting the town centre, and the Safer Neighbourhoods teams now have more officers because of the Uplift programme. And then the second part of the answer, again, it repeats what I said earlier, but the more we can strip out the bureaucracy, like the counting rules, and the more we can put the mental health work back where it belongs, where there's no criminality, no threat to public safety, to the NHS, that will free up resources, again, for investigating crime, prosecuting criminals, and visible neighbourhood policing. We're also providing specific funding for antisocial behaviour hotspot patrols. So it's being trialled in 10 forces at the moment, and it'll be rolled out to every force from April of next year, with a total of let me think, I think it's £43 million of funding from next April, additional to the regular police settlement, to fund ASB hotspot patrols. And when I went out with one of the forces piloting it, Lancashire, in Chorley town centre, it seemed to be working. The officers were visible in Chorley town centre, reassuring the public, and there was some, actually I was there on, it was a Tuesday afternoon or something, it wasn't even a Friday night, and there was some youths there causing a bit of trouble, and the officers dealt with it, and it made the place feel a lot safer. So I think that ASB hotspot patrol money will help too.
Okay, this will be the final question now, and I have to ask it because it's very, very popular. How can you bring the learning from across other government departments to steer chief constables on how they can more effectively increase the representation across the superintendent and chief officer ranks of people from Black, Asian and mixed heritage backgrounds, as this is and will continue to hinder delivering truly representative workforces when communities can't see leaders who they relate to?
Yeah, but I think that's a good and a fair question. I mean, the Uplift programme in the last 3 years, the intake has been a lot more representative than the police force in the past. I'm trying to remember the BME percentage. I think it's about 12% or somewhere in that region, certainly into mid teens in terms of BME representation. And the female representation, while not quite 50% in the intake, I think it's well over 40%, which again is significantly higher than the existing base of officers. So there we've got a whole stream of new recruits who are more representative. I think I will take that away as a point to think about with the MPCC. We'll try and draw lessons, as the question says, from elsewhere, because I think encouraging people from underrepresented backgrounds is important, because the question made the point very well. It does help build public confidence. And again, as a London MP, and it'll apply in many urban areas, Manchester, Birmingham, right across the West Midlands, Leicester, many other places, Bradford. It is important to demonstrate to the communities that, as Sir Robert Peel said, the police are the public are the police. So these are important issues.
OK, we will leave it there. Policing Minister, Right Honourable Chris Philp, thank you very much for joining us. We are here till tomorrow, so if you fancy coming down the motorway, please do. You'll be very welcome. And you can hear lots more questions, I'm sure, because we've got lots more. But sadly, we've run out of time. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you.
Thank you.